Today's book is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Quick background here. Ray Bradbury is a famous author. He's probably most famous for the book Fahrenheit 451, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't read yet. I will someday. But this is also one of his famous books. I've been aware of this book, I don't know, for about 10 years now. I don't remember where I first heard of it, but, I spend a lot of time on the internet doing these stupid searches and, going down rabbit holes on Wikipedia and stuff like that. And I stumbled across it, across the article for it about 10 years ago or so, and it sounded interesting. And the reason I finally got around to reading it this year, a couple reasons. Something that pushed this back to the front of my brain was a YouTube channel called Extra Credits, which earlier this year, I think 6 months ago, they did a 3-part series on this book. Very interesting. Check it out if you haven't already. I'll link to it in the description down below or something. Or just search Extra Credits, The Martian Chronicles. So that made me think again about this book and kind of pushed it up to the front of my brain. And then we've got a book club. And we had just been reading Don Quixote because we're kind of snobs. We like to stick to the classics. But boy, that book was exhausting. It just went on and on and on. And we haven't finished it yet, actually. But we needed a break. So I said, well, let's do a classic, but let's do a modern classic, a 20th century classic. And then I said, The Martian Chronicles. It's a classic, right? Ray Bradbury is one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. It's a science fiction classic. It's a modern classic, but it's a classic. I'm counting this. It counts as a classic. So we ended up reading it, and then here I am with the review. So if you haven't heard about this book, let me give some background. It originated as a series of short stories, which Ray Bradbury published between 1946 and 1950. About Earthmen going to Mars, or about Mars. Now, originally these were not connected. He was just, I don't know, it was just something on his mind or something, so he was writing a lot of stories that took place on Mars. But then one of his publishers said to him, why don't you kind of weave them together, maybe make some stories that kind of work as a framing device to kind of stick them together, and you can publish them all as one book, and we'll call it The Martian Chronicles. If you listen to the audiobook, Ray Bradbury kind of explains this himself in the introduction to the audiobook. And then in 1950, it was published. Now, it consists of, 20, 25 short stories. I actually haven't counted them. It consists of a bunch of short stories. Some of them are really short. Like, I don't know if you can see this. Rocket Summer, the first story, consists of half a page. Just kind of 5 measly short paragraphs. And that's the whole story. Many of them are longer. Right, what was I talking about? Oh, right, a lot of short stories. Now, there were even more short stories that Ray Bradbury had written about Mars, which didn't make it into the first edition of this book, but which made it into subsequent editions of the book. So there's like a complete Martian Chronicles or something like that, which came out, later. Which has even more stories added to it. And then some of the editions take out stories for various reasons. There's a story called, what's it called? way in the middle of the air, which is often omitted from the later editions for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk to later if I get time. Yeah, so point being, I guess there's different versions of this book with different collections of stories. And this actually, at the book club, when we met up for the book club to discuss it, there were, I don't know, about 6, 7 of us there. And one person had done the book by audiobook. And so she had actually read slightly different stories than the rest of us. Most of them were the same, but I think there were 2 stories that she had missed out on, and then 2 new stories in the audiobook that the rest of us hadn't heard about. And so this kind of came up when we were talking about like some of the issues portrayed in the book. We were talking about some stories that she didn't know about. She was talking about some of the stories that we didn't know about. Anyways, the edition I got, which I got off the internet, because I'm living in Vietnam and I have to, sorry. If I was living in the US, I'd totally go to a bookstore and pay full price. But I'm living in Vietnam, so I got this off of the internet. But this is the original 1950 version, with all the same stories that were published in the original 1950 version. No more, no less. Yeah, okay. Now that I got that out of the way, let me talk about the tone of this book. So, in broad terms, I'm gonna spoil a few things, but in broad terms, the story is about the fall of Martian civilization and kind of the coming of the human colonialists, and then kind of the rise and fall of the human civilization on Mars. And I knew that before going into the book, because I had read it somewhere on the internet, Wikipedia or something. So I thought that this book was going to be kind of a novel about civilizations, you know, kind of the way that science fiction kind of works as an alternate history. I was thinking, I don't know, maybe something like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where you've got kind of this overarching kind of story about the fall of a civilization, and it's kind of played relatively seriously. And that's what I was expecting, but that's not really what this book is at all. For one thing, again, to come back to what I was saying earlier, it's not really a novel so much as it is a short story anthology. Now, some of these do kind of weave together in a loose chronology, but some of them don't, and a lot of these just kind of stand together as their own story. So, you have the same issues with this book that you would have with any kind of short story anthology. Whereas, you're kind of reading the book, and you get invested in one story, and you're like, oh, right, I'm interested. I wonder what's going to happen. And then you get to the end of it, and you're like, oh, right, okay, that's the ending. Now I know what happened. And then you turn the page towards the next chapter, and it's a whole new story with a whole new situation, with a whole new set of characters, and you're like, oh, do I want to get invested in new characters all over again? I feel like I just got done getting invested in those other characters. Actually, no, I'm just going to close the book and go to bed for the night. At least that's me. That's my experience when I'm reading short stories. Is I find it hard to kind of keep the reading momentum going. I finish kind of one story and I feel like I'm done. I think, maybe I'm generalizing here, but I think many of us are that way. After all, novels always sell better than short story collections, right? People like to get into a longer story. They don't like a series of short stories. So that is something when you're reading the book, because it is a series of short stories, and so you do kind of have to get into them. What I would normally do is when I finish one story, I just go to bed, because I couldn't be bothered getting into the next story. But then the next day, I would get into the next story, and then once you get a couple pages into it, then you get hooked, because then there's usually some sort of mystery in these stories, a bit of a suspense. So once you get a couple pages in and you get to the hook, then you want to find out what's going to happen. And then it's hard to put down. So then you're just kind of reading, staying up a little bit late, maybe depending on what time of night you start reading the book. And then you get to the end of that story, and then shut it for the night and go to bed. So it's hard to keep a forward momentum from story to story, but the individual stories themselves are quite interesting once you get into them. The other thing that was a little bit different than my expectations is the tone of the book was different than what I was expecting. I was expecting kind of a story about civilizations and kind of, colonialism. And it is that. The theme of colonialism is very heavy in this book. Mars is obviously standing in for the American Wild West and the way the American colonialists kind of moved westward and kind of pushed out the native people. But then also kind of with the colonialization of the American West, the way it was kind of first kind of society's outcasts, like, the people who pushed west were the people who wanted to escape society, wanted to kind of get away from society's rules. And then afterwards kind of came the administrators and the religious people, and the rules kind of followed those people. So that's all in this book as well. It's one of the reoccurring themes, is similar to the American West. People come to Mars to escape civilization, but then kind of civilization follows them to Mars. And there's that clash between the original settlers who came to Mars and then the settlers who come afterwards. And then, of course, there's the native Martians who kind of just get kind of more or less pushed out completely. So that's all in there. But it's not, the tone is not completely straight. There's a lot of irony in this book. There's a lot of dark humor in this book. And there's a lot of kind of a fantastical element to it. So it's not entirely kind of a straight up epic narrative about civilizations. It's also just kind of this weirdly fantastical, satirical stories. I know I'm not doing a good job of explaining that. So maybe the best way to explain this is to give an example. So I'm gonna spoil one of the stories for the purposes of illustrating the general tone of the book. This story is, what was the name of it? The Earthmen. So the group of Earthmen land on Mars. And these are the first Earthmen ever to land on Mars. Actually, they're not, because there were 2 other expeditions before them that ended in failure. But forget about those. For the purposes of this story, they're the first Earthmen ever to land on Mars. And they land on Mars, and they go up to a Martian house, and they knock on the door. And the Martian housewife comes out, and they say, "We are from Earth. We've traveled all this way, and now we've come and landed on your planet." And the Martian housewife says, "Well, what are you bothering me for? Go away." And slams the door, and they knock again, and they say, No, you don't understand. We're from Earth. This is the first time this has ever happened. We've landed on Mars. And then she doesn't care. She's not interested. And they say, "Is there somebody else we can talk to?" And they kind of get passed from person to person. And nobody on Mars is interested at all in the fact that these are the first Earthmen who have landed. And in fact, they're just kind of annoyed by the fact that these Earthmen just keep introducing themselves. And eventually they're told to talk to this other guy. And this other guy says, oh, right. Okay, here you go. Sign these forms. Here's the key. Go in this room. And they go in this room, and to kind of make a long story short, to kind of cut to the climax, eventually they realize that they're in an insane asylum. And they're in this insane asylum with all these other people, well, Martians actually, all these Martians who think that they've come from other planets. So like another guy says, like, I'm from Earth, and they say, you're not from Earth, you're a Martian. But like this was a common mental problem on Mars, is that people thought they were from other planets and they all got put in this asylum. And the thing is, the Martians were telepathic, so they can kind of project images from their minds. So the fact that the Earthmen look like Earthmen, like they look physically different than Martians, didn't matter, because the Martians just assumed that their appearance was an hallucination that they were projecting telepathically, because that's like a power all Martians have. So they kept, and then the next day they realize what's happening, and the psychiatrist comes to examine them, and they say, no, you don't understand. We're not insane. We really are from Earth. He's like, boy, this delusion is strong. Don't worry, I'm going to try and cure you. Like, they just can't convince him. And then eventually, the psychiatrist says, you're too far gone. The only thing left to do is I'm just going to have to kill you to put you out of your misery. And they, at this point, they're like, no, what are you doing? But then he ends up just kind of shooting them all, and they all die. So, it's better if you read it. Ray Bradbury tells it better than I do. But that's kind of the tone of the book. It's kind of silly. There's usually some sort of mystery which starts at the beginning. Like, so there's something strange going on. You're like, what's going on? And then you find the answer, and it's usually something kind of darkly humorous or ironic. There's a lot of dark humor in this book. And that kind of violent ending where they all end up getting shot is not uncommon either. A lot of these stories have kind of violent endings. Ray Bradbury, according to Wikipedia, I was looking this up, I think, got kind of his start writing science fiction horror stories. So there is kind of a morbid horror element in there a little bit, but it's more kind of a dark irony in most of the stories. There's a suspense in a lot of these stories where you kind of know it's not going to end good, but you don't know exactly how. That kind of suspense keeps you reading a little bit. Yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, I guess just kind of a dark irony in a lot of these stories. And that kind of dark ironic humor is kind of all through a lot of this book. So it required me to adjust my expectations a little bit. It's not just a novel about the rise and fall of civilization. It's also kind of a lot of ironic stories with kind of morbid endings and kind of a dark humor. But that's not all. There are a number of different themes running through this book. To a large extent, kind of, I guess, each story is its own thing, so each story has its own themes. But there are some commonalities. Sentimentality is a big one. There are at least a couple of stories where people are kind of obsessed with memories from the past. Some of this plays into the Martian telepathy as well. But, people have lost loved ones or relatives throughout the years, and they've never quite kind of healed that, and then they're through some sort of fantastical event, they're able to kind of relive it a little bit and kind of try and reconnect with these memories from the past. I'm being a little bit vague to avoid spoiling stuff too much, even though this is a spoiler review. I am spoiling a lot. This was, I'll be honest, this was a little bit of a downer at points, you know, because you do kind of try and go through your day trying not to think too much about how kind of death is kind of always stalking you and all your loved ones, and how this kind of loss of people you love is part of life, you know. I mean, it is part of life, but you try not to think about that too much in your day-to-day life. But then you get a book like this, which forces you to think about it. So there were points where I was like, this is just depressing. And it is a bit, but, you know, I guess it's life, right? You got to think about this stuff sometimes. So that's one of the themes that kind of runs throughout a number of the stories of the book. Another theme, and you wouldn't really expect this maybe in a book called The Martian Chronicles, but there's a lot of nostalgia in this book for the old small town American way of life, which pops up in a few different stories. Again, kind of the Martians are able to telepathically recreate some of the small towns that some of these men are from. But there's also a bit of a small town vibe to a lot of the towns created on Mars. And it's interesting, you know, like Ray Bradbury wrote these stories in the 1940s. And he kind of portrayed the American small town as kind of something that his characters were nostalgic for. But like, I think the American small town does not really exist anymore, or at the very least it does not exist in the same way it existed in the 1940s when Ray Bradbury wrote this book. I mean, kind of the industrialization of agriculture has kind of killed off like the small farms. All the jobs are kind of in the mega cities now, right? So kind of all the young people have left the small towns. And I think the small towns are dying now, or died 30 years ago, or whatever. So it's interesting reading this book now and thinking, yeah, boy, those small towns, there are not really a lot of them left anymore, which is sad. So it's like a futuristic book, but it's got a lot of nostalgia for a time, an Americana that no longer exists anymore. The American small town. It's pretty obvious if you read this book. This is one of those themes that just kind of bops you over the head. But also in the audiobook, if you listen to the introduction to that, Ray Bradbury kind of says explicitly that he was kind of inspired by some small town Ohio stories that he had been reading when he wrote a lot of these stories. So that's another theme. Other themes in this book. Okay, well, I'm going to spoil something again. The end of the book kind of deals with nuclear war, which is happening back on Earth. So it's about Mars, but the colonists are coming from Earth, and then they're affected by the news of the nuclear war that happens on Earth. There's one story, There Will Come Soft Rains, which I know this is nobody else cares about this but me, but I actually read that story way back when I was like 12, almost 30 years ago now, and I had completely forgotten about it. And then as I was reading it, I kind of remembered, I've read this before. One of those, memory's a funny thing. Like, I didn't remember it at all, but once I started reading it again, then it kind of triggered it. And once that memory was jarred loose, Then I remembered like where I was when I was reading it, kind of how I felt on like that hot summer afternoon while I was reading it. You know, there's a lot of kind of stuff kind of locked up in your memory that you don't even realize. And then once something cues it up, then all those memories kind of come out at once. Memory is a funny thing, isn't it? Anyways, I had read this story about 30 years before when I was 12. And it wasn't part of the Martian Chronicles. It was in a science fiction anthology book I picked up at the library because it stands independently. Most of these stories actually stand independently. And it was just about a futuristic house that was kind of completely automated and cleaned itself and kind of, you know, did all these things automatically. Going through the motions of doing things automatically after everyone who lives in the house had been wiped out by a nuclear bomb. So kind of like an eerie story about like the house continuing to run even though people are no longer there. And that story, as well as I think a lot of the stuff about the nuclear war on Earth, was written in 1950, which probably isn't a surprise because, you know, you think what the first atomic bomb exploded in 1945. So in 1946, 1947, 1948, 1950, this was something that was on people's minds. You know, this was a time when everyone was writing science fiction about nuclear bombs and nuclear wars and stuff like that. So this was very topical at the time it was written. It strikes me, I was thinking about this, arguably it should still be topical now because nuclear weapons haven't gone away. In fact, they're much worse now than they were back then because now we've got the H-bomb, which is much worse than the atomic bomb. They proliferated like mad, right? So now we've got much more nuclear bombs on Earth than we had in 1950. So we should be more worried about it now, but nobody's writing about it now. It's an unfortunate thing of kind of human nature. Unfortunately, we're not completely rational creatures. If we were completely rational creatures, we would have said, right, these nuclear bombs are a problem. Let's do something about it. Let's come to some sort of agreement and get rid of them. But we never did. And instead, what we did is we just kind of stopped worrying about them. Because, you know, it's exhausting to worry about it for 70 years. So people just don't worry about it anymore. We just never solved that problem. And now we've got other problems to worry about. I don't know. Sorry, that's just me being pessimistic. I guess the point is, nuclear war is a big theme near the end of the book. And you can imagine this being very topical at the time the book was written in the 1950s. It should still be topical now, but it's not. We've moved on to worry about other things. Oh, I almost forgot. I said I was going to come back to that book, Way in the Middle of the Air. So Way in the Middle of the Air is about kind of a small southern town in which all the black people decide to leave and go up to Mars. And it's really ironic because, you know, there are all these, it's this typical, I guess, racist southern town. I've only got 1 minute left. Sorry, this camera has a 30-minute time limit. I'm not going to be able to talk about this. It's an interesting story and somewhat controversial. So look it up on Wikipedia, I guess. I'm out of time. I'm going to have to finish the book review here.